Why would a flight attendant beg a quiet middle-aged man to fake being sick and leave a plane during boarding? I thought she was overreacting, or maybe I was the target of some strange joke, until she came back a second time with fear in her eyes and said she was begging me to get off. 20 minutes later, sitting at the gate watching that same plane surrounded by emergency vehicles, I understood exactly why. Before we dive deeper into this story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible stories. My name is Graham, and I used to work on aircraft for a living. For more than 20 years, I was the quiet man in the hangar with a flashlight, a checklist, and a worn-out tool bag. People walked past me at airports and never noticed me. That was fine. I liked being invisible. I liked knowing the aircraft were safe, even if no one knew my name. On that morning, I was at Denver International with a small backpack and a printed boarding pass. I was flying to Phoenix to see my mother for her birthday. It was the last month I could use my staff travel benefit after losing my job at SkyReach Air. I told myself this trip would be simple, no drama. Just a short flight, a rental car, and a homemade cake in a small kitchen. The departure board showed my flight as on time. SkyReach Flight 712 to Phoenix, boarding at Gate C23. I went to the gate early and took a seat near the window. The aircraft was already parked there, nose toward the glass, with a bright SkyReach logo on the tail. I knew the model by heart. I knew where every major system sat under the skin. I tried not to think like an engineer anymore, but it never really turns off. Soon the gate area filled with people, families with tired children, business travelers with laptops. A group of SkyReach employees in company polo shirts gathered near the podium. I noticed two younger mechanics leaning on the rail, joking in low voices. I did not want to listen, but my ears picked up certain words by habit. One of them mentioned an old inspector who used to halt departures over tiny things. The other one laughed and called him paranoid and said management had finally taken care of that problem. They did not use my name, but it was clear who they meant. There had only been one inspector who stood his ground that way at this base, and that was me. I felt my face warm, but I kept my eyes on the glass. I did not turn around. I did not correct them. That part of my life was over, I told myself. I was just a regular passenger now, in cheap jeans and a plain jacket, holding a boarding pass like everyone else. Then I heard another voice that I knew too well. Tyler. He was a junior maintenance manager when I still worked there. Fast rise, sharp smile, quick to agree with whatever the top wanted. I saw his reflection in the glass as he walked by with a tablet in his hand and a group of staff behind him. He slowed when he noticed me. For a second his eyes flicked to my old SkyReach backpack. Then he spoke loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. He remarked to his group that some people never understood modern turnaround times, that they used to cause delays with old ideas about safety, and that such people were not a fit for the new culture. He added that this kind of thinking almost cost them contracts. I felt the air change around me as a few heads turned. No one laughed out loud, but there were small smiles and raised brows. I sat still. I could have stood up and answered him. I could have listed the systems I had saved. Instead, I looked at my shoes and let the words pass over me like cold rain. It was easier to be the quiet man even when every word cut a little. Boarding started soon after. They called for people who needed extra time, then elite members, then zones. My group was one of the last. I stood in line and moved slowly down the jet bridge with the others. The smell of jet fuel drifted in through some gap, familiar and strange at the same time. I touched the side of the aircraft at the door, a habit I never lost, as if greeting an old friend. Inside, the cabin was the usual mix of tight seats and overhead bins. People wrestled with bags. A baby cried somewhere near the back. The air already felt warm. I moved down the aisle, checked my seat number, and slid into my window seat over the wing. I put my backpack under the seat and tried to relax. That was when I first noticed the flight attendant who would change my day. She was working the front section, moving fast but with careful eyes. Later I learned her name, but at that moment she was just another crew member in a neat uniform with a tired face. She stopped at my row and looked at me for half a second longer than normal, then checked the manifest in her hand. I saw her eyes move from the paper to my face, then back again. Something in her expression shifted. She moved on to the next row, but her jaw was tight now. I told myself I was imagining it. Maybe she knew my name from some old story. Maybe Tyler had said something about me in crew chat. It did not matter, I thought. I was just here to go to Phoenix. Boarding continued. People bumped my shoulder as they squeezed past. A man behind me made a joke to his partner about hoping the aircraft did not fall apart since it was a budget airline. She told him not to say such things. I stared at the wing outside my window. The paint looked new. The metal did not. A few minutes later, the same flight attendant came back down the aisle, this time without the manifest board. She stopped at my row and leaned in slightly. Her voice was low and fast. She told me that I should pretend I was feeling unwell and asked to leave the aircraft. She said I could tell them I felt dizzy, anything, but I needed to step off before they closed the door. For a moment, I thought I had misheard. Then I thought it was a strange joke. I asked, in a quiet voice, why I would do that. She said she could not explain fully in front of passengers, but she knew who I was, and she had seen notes in the system about me and this aircraft. She said she had a bad feeling and did not want me on this flight. I looked around. Nearby passengers had gone quiet, trying not to stare, but clearly listening. The man behind me shifted in his seat. Someone 2 rows up glanced back. I could almost feel their thoughts. Nervous guy, making trouble. Old employee who cannot let go. I felt heat in my neck. For years, I had been the one who calmed people. Now, in their eyes, I was the one who might cause a scene. I told her I was fine. I told her I just wanted to go see my mother. I said there was no need to involve the gate agents. That was what my words said. Inside, I was thinking that Tyler had set this up as some final insult, using crew to push me out under the excuse of sickness. It fit his style. She looked frustrated, but she stepped away because the cabin speaker pinged and another attendant called her name from the front. She walked off quickly. The man behind me muttered something about nervous flyers. I pressed my head back into the seat. For the first time in a long time, I felt my heart beating too fast. A few minutes passed. Overhead bins slammed shut. The captain gave a short welcome over the speaker. The cabin crew prepared the door. Then, to my surprise, the same attendant came back again. This time her eyes looked different. There was clear fear there, not annoyance, not drama. She bent down, closer to my ear, and spoke even more quietly. She told me she was begging me to leave the aircraft. She said maintenance had rushed work on this plane that morning and signed off on something that made her uneasy. She said there was an internal note connected to my name and this registration, and that she trusted her instincts. She added that I did not have to explain anything. I could just say I felt sudden nausea and go. Her hand was resting on the top of my seat. I noticed it shook just a little. That detail broke through my pride. This did not feel like a joke anymore. I had seen real fear in hangar eyes before, and this was the same kind. I looked down the long, narrow aisle toward the front. Many faces were turned toward us now, pretending not to stare. If I stood up, I knew what it would look like. Weak man, scared of flying. Maybe people would talk about it later. Maybe Tyler would hear about it and laugh. A part of me wanted to stay seated just to prove a point. To myself, if no one else. But there is a strange thing that happens when you work in safety for many years. At some point, your own pride becomes less important than even a small chance that something is wrong. I took a slow breath and nodded. I told her I would say I did not feel well. She gave the slightest sigh of relief, then told the nearby passengers in a calm voice that there was a small issue and they needed to let me out. People pulled their legs back with annoyed faces. The man behind me looked irritated. I stood, feeling every eye in that cabin on my back, and pulled my backpack from under the seat. As I moved down the aisle, I heard low comments. One person wondered if I knew something they did not. Another said that this is why they hate flying, because people panic for no reason. A child asked a parent if the plane was safe. The parent said it was fine, that the man was probably just nervous. I kept my eyes forward and walked past row after row. It felt like the longest walk of my life. At the front, the purser met me with a polite face and led me out onto the jet bridge. The door closed behind us with a firm sound. Out there, the air was cooler and quieter. She asked me softly again if I felt okay. I said I felt fine now that I was off the plane. At the gate podium, the agent looked annoyed. She asked what happened. The attendant told her I had felt sick and needed to deplane. The agent gave me a strained smile and said they would see if they could put me on a later flight, but my staff ticket was not flexible and the aircraft was nearly full. Her tone made it clear that I was a problem, not a person. A few minutes later, they scanned my boarding pass again to cancel it. The jet bridge door closed, the aircraft pushed back from the gate. I watched through the large windows as it slowly turned and started to taxi toward the runway. I felt both foolish and strangely light, like I had stepped off a track that everyone else was still stuck on. The agent told me to take a seat nearby while she checked options. I walked to a row of chairs by the window and sat down, my backpack at my feet. The terminal noise hummed around me. Announcements rose and fell. Other aircraft moved in slow lines across the tarmac. Flight 712 was a small shape now, heading along the taxiway. I remember looking at the registration letters on its tail and recognizing them from old reports. A small chill went through me, but I pushed the thought away. I told myself that I was being dramatic, that nothing would happen, that in a few hours that aircraft would be in Phoenix, and my mother would call to ask why I had not shown up. About 20 minutes later, something changed in the scene outside the window. The aircraft that had left my gate was no longer moving toward the runway. It sat stopped on the taxiway, a little off to the side. I saw small vehicles racing toward it from different directions, lights flashing. A fire truck, an operations truck, an ambulance. They gathered around the plane like metal insects. Inside the terminal, there was no announcement at first. Just the silent picture through the glass. The still aircraft, the busy ground trucks, the flashing lights that reflected off the fuselage. I sat there, my hands on my backpack straps, and a tight feeling grew in my chest. I did not know yet what had happened on that aircraft, but I knew one thing, with absolute clarity. I was supposed to be on that plane, and I was not. That night, back in my apartment, the noise of the airport still echoed in my head. I put my backpack down by the door and stood there in the dark for a moment. My place was small. One bedroom, a narrow kitchen, and a living room with a second-hand sofa and a small table. Outside, traffic hummed, but inside, it was just the faint buzz of my old fridge. I turned on the light and went to the kitchen. I poured a glass of water and tried to swallow the tight feeling in my throat. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that aircraft sitting on the taxiway with vehicles around it. I told myself it was probably nothing, maybe a sensor alert, maybe a sick passenger. Still, my hand shook a little as I held the glass. I took my phone from my pocket and opened the news app. At first, there was nothing, just the usual stories and some sports results. Then, after refreshing the feed, I saw a short local alert near the bottom. It said there had been a minor technical incident with a SkyReach flight from Denver to Phoenix. It said the aircraft had returned to the gate because the crew had noticed an indication and some passengers reported an odor in the cabin. The article used soft words. Minor. Precaution. Non-event. I knew that language. I had helped write internal reports many times. When an airline said minor, it often meant something that scared people but did not cause a crash. When they said non-event, it usually meant they wanted everyone to move on and forget it. I read the small paragraph again, then same flight number, same departure time. It was my flight. I put the phone down on the table and stared at the grain in the wood. For years, I had fought with management about exactly this mindset. If nothing tragic happened, they called it a non-event. No matter how close it had come, no matter who had felt real fear in the cabin. On the shelf near my old television was a row of binders and folders. Most people would have thrown them away when they left a job. I had not. They held copies of old reports, printouts of technical notes, photos, and checklists. I had kept them partly out of habit, partly because something in me did not trust how quickly the company changed its story each year. I went to the shelf and pulled down a blue binder with a faded label. The plastic felt cool in my hands. I opened it on the coffee table and turned the pages slowly. There were maintenance notes, inspection forms, highlighted areas with my handwriting in the margins. My handwriting was small, neat, sometimes cramped. I saw dates from 3, 4, 5 years ago. Halfway through, a familiar aircraft registration caught my eye. 4 letters and numbers together. I whispered them out loud to myself. They matched the tail I had seen on the aircraft that day. It was the same one. My chest felt tight again. I flipped the page. There was a report I had written about a particular system on that aircraft. I had circled a part number and added a comment in pen. I had warned that repeated signs of wear and heat marks on that part were not normal, even if the built-in system said it was within limits. I had recommended a full replacement on that aircraft and a fleet-wide review. Next to my report was a copy of the response from management at the time. It said that my suggestion was beyond manufacturer guidance and would cause unnecessary out-of-service time. It said they would monitor the situation instead. We all knew what that meant. Minimal extra checks, nothing more. I closed the binder for a moment and pressed my palms against my eyes. Old anger moved in my chest like a slow wave. It was not hot anymore, not like when I first read that answer years ago. It was a colder, heavier feeling now, a weight that had settled over time. My memory drifted back to the maintenance hangar. I could almost smell the mix of fuel, oil, and cleaning fluid, the place where I had spent most of my life. In my mind, I stood again under the bright white lights, looking up at the underside of an aircraft. I remembered the day I called Tyler over to show him a hairline mark on a component. I had pointed to it with my flashlight. I had said I did not like the pattern of discoloration. I had explained that it matched a known failure mode from an older model, even if the system readings were still in the green. Tyler had nodded, but his eyes had wandered. He had said that he trusted my experience, but also had to think about on-time performance. He had said Victor wanted fewer delays. He had suggested we log it and watch it, rather than ground the aircraft. Later, I heard him in the break room talking to another mechanic. He did not know I was in the next aisle. He said I was still stuck in the past, that I treated every small mark like a crisis. He joked that if it were up to me, half the fleet would sit in the hangar instead of flying. There was light laughter. At the time, I told myself it did not matter. I had done my duty by raising the issue. Another memory came, the big corporate auditorium at headquarters. They had called it a culture change meeting, rows of seats filled with staff in uniform and office clothes, a stage with bright lights and a large screen. Victor on stage with a microphone, smiling, talking about a new era of efficiency. At one point, he spoke about turnaround times and how delays hurt the brand. He said there were still some people who thought safety meant always saying no. He said this old mindset needed to change. While he said this, he glanced toward my row. I saw a few faces turn, just for a second. No one said my name. They did not have to. Everyone knew who always called for extra checks. Victor told a story about a flight that nearly missed a slot because of what he called an unnecessary inspection. He did not mention that the inspection had found a loose fitting. He only talked about the delay. The room laughed at the part where he described the frustrated passengers at the gate. He presented the whole event as a lesson in overreaction. I had sat there in the dim light, my hands folded in my lap, listening. I did not stand up. I did not explain my side. It would have sounded like self-defense, and that never plays well in a room like that. The next clear memory was the HR office. Smaller, quieter, beige walls, and a fake plant in the corner. A printed document on the table, a woman from HR with a kind voice that did not match her words. She had explained that the company was restructuring my role. She said that my position as a senior inspector no longer fit the new structure. She said that my approach, while thorough, was not aligned with the new culture. She said there was no performance issue on paper, but they needed people who could balance safety with efficiency. There were phrases in her script I had seen many times in internal notes about others. Not a culture fit. Moving in a new direction. It was a clean way to push someone out without writing down the real reason. She slid the paper toward me. It offered a small severance if I agreed not to challenge the dismissal. It also said my staff travel benefit would last for 6 months after my end date. She told me I should be grateful for the extra months of travel. She said some companies would not offer that. She said she hoped I would see this as a chance for a new chapter. I remember looking at that paper and feeling strangely calm. I had already known this was coming. When someone like Victor wants you gone, they do not need a big excuse. They just wait until the next reshuffle. I had placed my phone face down on the table at the start of the meeting. Before that, I had tapped record. I had not done it to trap anyone, at least that is what I told myself. I had done it because I wanted to hear later, with clear ears, if I was imagining the tone, or if they really were saying what I thought they were saying. In the recording, which I listened to many weeks later, I heard HR repeat Victor's lines almost word for word. She spoke about my high standards in a way that made them sound like a problem. She said higher management valued my past work but needed flexibility now. The polite words covered the simple truth. I was too costly, not in pay, but in minutes and hours. I had signed the paper. I had walked out of that office with my small box of things. A framed certificate, a few tools I had bought myself, a picture of my first day on the job. Since then, I had tried to move on. I did some consulting for a small repair shop. I took care of my mother's bills. I kept my head down. Now, sitting in my living room with the blue binder open, it did not feel like a new chapter anymore. It felt like a story that had never really ended. I turned back to the report page and traced the edge of my own note with one finger. Then I looked at the registration number again and said it out loud. It was the same aircraft from that day. The same machine I had worried about. The same one that had just filled with an odor strong enough to make them turn back. On the coffee table, my phone lit up with a small vibration. I ignored it at first. My eyes stayed on the binder. After a minute, the screen went dark again. Then it lit up a second time with another message. This time I reached for it and checked. It was a short text from an old mechanic friend at the base. He rarely wrote. He had stayed at SkyReach when I left because he had a mortgage and 2 children and no real choice. The message was brief. He said there had been fumes in the cabin of Flight 712, that some passengers had felt dizzy, and that the crew had insisted on returning to the gate. He added one more line. He wrote that my old report about that aircraft had been right, and that I should see something before it disappeared. The message from my friend sat on the screen for a long moment while I stared at it. The room felt even smaller than before. I read the words again, slowly, as if they might change. Fumes in the cabin, passengers dizzy. My old report had been right. He said I should see something before it disappeared. I typed back and asked what he meant. My fingers moved stiffly on the screen. For a while, there was no answer. I set the phone down and walked to the sink, rinsed my empty glass, and tried to act normal. Water ran over my hands, but I did not feel it much. My head was loud with thoughts. The phone vibrated again on the table. I dried my hands and picked it up. This time, my friend had sent a longer message. He said maintenance logs showed a rushed sign-off on the same system I had warned about. He said there had been a note from Tyler approving a quicker procedure to avoid grounding the aircraft. He added that he had seen internal messages in their chat where some staff joked about me and called my old report an overreaction. He said he could not send screenshots because IT monitored their phones, but he wanted me to know. He ended with one more sentence. He wrote that he was scared, not of me, not of the aircraft, but of the way everyone seemed ready to move on again, as if nothing serious had happened. I sank down onto the sofa with the phone still in my hand. The old springs creaked under my weight. For some time, I just sat there, reading the messages over and over. Fumes, rushed sign-off, jokes about my report, fear of speaking. There was a time earlier in my career when I would have marched straight to a manager's office with this information. I would have laid out the details and insisted on action. That was before the culture meetings, before the not a culture fit talk, before Victor's new era of efficiency. Now, I was not even an employee. I was an outsider with a box of old papers and a fading travel benefit. I could picture exactly how a call to the company hotline would go. They would thank me for my concern, promise to look into it, and then file my name under former staff with a grudge. Still, something inside me refused to let it rest. It was the same part that had made me circle that part number in the blue binder, the same part that had made me tap record before my exit interview. I had tried to ignore that part since losing my job, but it had waited patiently in the background. I stood up and went back to the shelf. This time I took down not just the blue binder, but two more. One was green, one black. I carried them to the table and opened each one. My notes were inside, neatly dated. Reports about minor incidents, near misses, unusual wear patterns, sensor anomalies. Most had simple resolutions. A part replaced, a wiring check done, a line cleaned. But as I flipped through, I began to notice something I had not seen clearly before. The same aircraft registration appeared again and again, sometimes months apart, sometimes closer. It was not always the same system, but it was always that aircraft. Next to one entry, I had written a short line in pen. Recommend full structural and systems review at next check. Next to it, a typed note from management. Defer to standard schedule. On another page, I had attached 3 photos of a component, each taken months apart. The heat markings spread a little more each time. My photos were clear, my comments careful. Under them, in the official printout, was a short line from a manager. Within tolerance, monitor only. I felt my jaw tighten as I turned each page. It was like watching the same scene play out in slow motion, over and over, while everyone else pretended not to see it. I got up and went to my small desk in the corner. In the top drawer, under some old receipts, was a cheap external drive. I plugged it into my laptop and waited for it to wake up. When I left SkyReach, I had copied some of my own work files onto this drive. Only things I had personally written, plus some photos I had taken. At the time, I was not sure why I did it. Now I was glad. The folders appeared on the screen. I clicked through them. There were scanned copies of my reports, saved emails approving extra checks, photos of damaged parts. There was also a folder named Exit Tertius, Personal. I opened it and saw an audio file with a date from the week I left the company. I clicked play. The sound of the HR office filled my living room. The room tone was different, but the voices were the same as in my memory. I heard my own polite greeting. I heard the HR representative explain the restructuring again. I heard the phrases that had bothered me then, but sounded even more pointed now. She repeated Victor's lines about my style not fitting the new model. She said the company appreciated my attention to detail, but needed inspectors who could adapt to modern timelines. She said some people created unnecessary obstacles, even though they meant well. She never said you caused delays, but every word pointed in that direction. Listening to it in my quiet apartment, with the aircraft incident fresh in my mind, it did not sound neutral anymore. It sounded like someone carefully moving me out of the way because I did not fit their plan. The recording ended. For a few seconds, the laptop fan was the only sound. Then my fridge clicked on again in the kitchen. It was a small, ordinary noise, but it made me realize how alone I was with all of this. The company had its lawyers, its public relations team, its control over logs. I had my old binders, my external drive, and a text from a scared mechanic. I shut the laptop and leaned back in my chair. My eyes drifted to a framed picture on the wall. It was an old photo of me standing next to an aircraft on my first week at SkyReach. I looked younger, thinner, hopeful. My hand rested on the fuselage, and I was smiling in that awkward way people do when they are not used to cameras. I remembered how proud I had been then. A kid from a small town, now responsible for real machines that carried real people. I had told myself that my job was simple. Look carefully, speak up when something looked wrong, and never, ever let pressure change that. Somewhere along the way, the company had decided that this simple rule was a problem. I did not realize how long I sat there until my phone buzzed again. It was a short message from my sister Lisa, asking if I had made it to Phoenix. I stared at the text for a moment before answering. I told her something had happened with the flight and I had not gone. She sent back a worried line, asked if I was all right, and offered to call. I told her I was tired and would explain later. After that, I put the phone face down on the table. I did not want any more distractions. My mind was starting to arrange things into a line. My past reports, the company's responses, the rushed sign-off my friend mentioned, the fumes on the flight, the way the airline already called it a non-event. For years, I had reacted to these patterns with anger and complaint. I had argued in break rooms, raised my voice in meetings, written long emails. None of it had changed much. Now there was a different feeling forming under the anger. It was quieter, denser. It was the sense that there might be a way to move this out of the company's private world and into a place they did not control. I opened the laptop again and searched my email archive. I remembered meeting an aviation lawyer once at a retirement party for an older mechanic. She had given a short talk about safety law and whistleblower protection. At the time, I had thought it did not apply to me. I was just doing my job, I had told myself. Why would I ever need a lawyer? I found her name in a very old message. The subject line was about a seminar. Her contact details were at the bottom. I read the name twice, then opened a new note on my phone and typed it in there as well. I did not call yet. Instead, I saved the number and set the phone down again. I needed to be sure before I reached out. I needed more than anger and impression. I needed a clear story with dates and records, not just feelings. The next morning, I went back to the airport. Not to fly, but to talk. My friend from maintenance had said he was on an early shift. We arranged to meet in a corner of an airport cafe where staff often sat. It was half hidden behind a newsstand, away from passengers. He arrived in his work clothes, looking tired. His eyes kept moving around the room, checking who was nearby. He sat down across from me with a coffee that he barely touched. He spoke in a low voice. He told me that after the incident, there had been a short flurry of messages in their internal chat. Some crew had shared what they smelled, what they felt. A few mechanics had raised questions about the maintenance on that aircraft. Then a manager stepped in and wrote that they should leave the investigation to the proper channels and avoid speculation. After that, the messages grew quiet. He said he had looked at the maintenance entry for that morning. A particular part, the same one I had circled in my report, had been noted as checked and cleared. The total time recorded for that task was shorter than usual. The signature line showed Tyler's approval. There was a comment about keeping the aircraft in service to meet schedule. He rubbed his hands together as he talked, like he was cold even in the warm cafe. He said that when he saw my old report and the new incident side by side, he felt sick. He said he did not know who to trust inside the company anymore. He did not want to lose his job. He did not want to ignore it either. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, I asked if he had kept any copies of the logs. He shook his head quickly. He said everything was on the company system. Downloading or taking pictures could get him in trouble. He said he had only his memory, and that was starting to feel like a weak thing against such a large organization. I told him I understood. I did not ask him to risk more. Instead, I asked simple questions to help me build the timeline. Exact dates, shift details, who signed what, who was on duty. He answered as best he could. I wrote notes in a small notebook I had brought. When we were done, he looked at me with a mix of hope and fear. He asked what I planned to do. For a moment, I did not answer. I realized that this was the point where, in the past, I would have said I would write another report and hand it to the same people who had ignored me before. This time, the answer that came out of my mouth was different. I told him I was going to take this outside the company. Not to social media, not to angry posts, but to people whose job it was to look at these situations from the outside. I said I would handle it in a proper, careful way. He nodded slowly, as if he was not sure whether to believe it, but wanted to. Before leaving, he thanked me quietly for not letting it go. Then he walked back toward the staff area, shoulders slightly hunched. I left the cafe and went home. The sun was bright outside, the sky clear, Planes moved in and out as if nothing unusual had ever happened. On the train back to my neighborhood, I took out my phone, opened the note with the lawyer's name, and stared at the number. By the time I reached my stop, my mind had moved past the point of doubt. This was not about winning an argument with Victor anymore. It was not about getting my job back or proving I had been right. It was about putting what I knew into a place where it could not be quietly edited or erased. I walked up the stairs from the platform, the phone warm in my hand. On the sidewalk outside the station, with cars passing and people hurrying by, I opened the dialer, entered the number, and pressed the call button. The call connected after a few rings. A clear, calm voice answered and gave her name, the same one I had written down years ago. For a second, I almost hung up. Then I said who I was and that I used to be a safety inspector for SkyReach. She went quiet for a moment, not in a rude way, more like she was searching her memory. Then she said she remembered the retirement party where we had met. She asked how she could help. I felt my throat tighten. I had spent so long not talking about this to anyone outside the company that the words came out slow at first. I told her there had been an incident on a SkyReach flight the day before. I said I had been booked on that flight as a passenger but did not fly. I explained in simple terms that I had written past reports about that same aircraft and that I believed my firing was connected to those reports. I kept my voice as steady as I could. She listened without interrupting. I could hear the faint sound of keys on her end, like she was typing notes. When I finished, she asked a few short questions. She wanted the flight number, the date, the aircraft registration if I knew it. She asked how long I had worked for the company and when I had left. She asked if I had kept any documents. When I said yes, there was a small pause. Then she told me that keeping personal copies of my own reports and notes was useful. She said that if I wanted to talk more, it would be better to do it in person with the papers in front of us. She asked if I could come to her office the next day. After I agreed, she gave me the address and a time. Before we ended the call, she told me one more thing. She said I should not contact SkyReach about this for now, and that I should not share any files with current staff. She said it was better to first understand exactly what I had and where it fit in the law. When the call ended, I stood on the sidewalk for a moment. The city moved around me, cars passing, people talking, a bus pulling up at the corner. My phone felt heavier in my hand. For the first time since leaving SkyReach, I had told someone outside the company that something was wrong. It felt strange and also right, like finally stepping onto the correct path after walking along the edge for too long. The next morning, I put my binders and the external drive into a worn messenger bag. I added my small notebook with the details my friend had given me. I hesitated, then also printed a copy of the local news article about Flight 720, even though it was vague. Paper made things feel more real. Nora's office was in a simple building downtown. No big glass front, no flashy signs. The lobby had a faint smell of coffee and old carpet. I took the elevator up to the 4th floor. Her door had a small plate with her name and the words aviation law under it. Inside, the office was neat, but not stiff. Shelves lined the walls, filled with binders and books. A wide desk stood near the window with a computer and a stack of folders. There was a table with 4 chairs in the center of the room. She stood up from her chair when I came in and offered her hand. Her grip was firm, her eyes clear. We sat at the table. I placed my bag on the chair next to me and began to take out the binders. I felt almost embarrassed by how worn they looked. She did not seem to mind. She asked me to start from the beginning, not just from yesterday, but from the first time I felt the company's attitude change towards safety. So I told her. I spoke about the hangar, about Tyler, about Victor's culture speech, about the day in the HR office. I described the reports I had written on that one aircraft. I pointed to dates and part numbers. I explained what I had seen during my last inspections and how my concerns had been labeled as overcautious. She asked clear, simple questions. When I mentioned my recording of the exit interview, she leaned forward slightly and asked if she could listen to it. I plugged in the external drive to my laptop and played the audio. The HR voice filled the room again, soft and professional, saying that my standards did not fit the new model. When it ended, Nora sat back and thought for a moment. Then she told me that this recording, together with my reports, could show a pattern. She said that if I was fired because I insisted on safety, and then the same issue led to an incident, authorities would take that seriously. She opened a folder and took out a printed checklist she used with clients. On it were items like timeline, documents, witnesses, company communication. She went through them one by one with me. For each item, she asked what I had and what I could possibly get. At the word witnesses, I mentioned my friend in maintenance and the flight attendant who had urged me to leave the aircraft. I did not know her name yet, but I described her and the way she had spoken to me. Nora wrote this down carefully and circled it. She explained that there were laws to protect people who reported safety issues in aviation. She said the details were complex, but the basic idea was simple. Companies could not punish workers for raising honest safety concerns. She said that since I was no longer employed, some parts would be different, but that did not remove my right to be heard. She suggested we do two things. First, file a confidential report with the National Safety Board, including my past reports and what I knew about the recent incident. Second, prepare a separate file in case it became necessary to speak to SkyReach's board or to other bodies that oversee companies. I asked her if going to the safety board would automatically make this public. She said no, not at first. She explained that such boards often investigate quietly, gather evidence, and only later decide what should be shared with the public. She said the main goal was always to prevent future harm. She also told me something that stayed with me. She said that once a matter was in the hands of regulators, it was much harder for a company to hide or edit documents. There would be legal obligations to preserve logs and messages. That alone made me feel like the ground under my feet was more solid. We agreed that I would leave copies of my binders with her. She would scan and organize them into a simple package. One set of documents that showed the pattern on that specific aircraft, and one set that showed how the company responded to my warnings. She would handle the wording for the safety board, but she wanted me to review it before sending. When I left her office, I walked out with my bag much lighter, but my mind more full. The afternoon sun was bright on the sidewalk. For the first time in a long while, my steps felt firm. A few days later, Nora called me and said that the safety board wanted to speak with me in person. She said she had sent them a summary, and they seemed to take it seriously. She asked if I could come with her to their regional office. The building was different from SkyReach headquarters. It did not have glossy posters or marketing screens. It was plain, functional. Inside, the air smelled of paper and printer toner. We sat in a small lobby until an investigator came out to greet us. He introduced himself as Raj. Tall, thoughtful eyes, simple suit. He led us to a modest conference room. On the table were a few sheets of paper and a tablet. No banners, no slogans, just work. Raj spoke in a balanced tone. He said they had opened a preliminary file on the incident with Flight 712 because of multiple crew reports. He said that my information might help them understand whether the issue was limited to this one event or part of a wider pattern. He asked me to go through my history with SkyReach, focusing on the aircraft in question. I repeated the story I had told Nora, but this time I kept my words even more simple. I mentioned dates, registration numbers, the system I had concerns about. I described my past reports and the company responses. He listened carefully, sometimes taking notes, sometimes asking clarifying questions. When I mentioned the rushed sign-off my friend had seen in the logs, he wrote down exact times and names. He did not react with surprise. Instead, he treated each detail like a small part of a larger picture. Nora spoke occasionally to clarify legal points. She mentioned the exit interview recording and how it seemed to link my dismissal with my safety stance. She pointed out that this could show pressure to ignore or soften concerns. Raj asked if I was willing to provide copies of my materials. I said yes. That had been my plan from the start. I had brought a digital copy of the important documents on a separate drive. He accepted it and said they would handle it according to their procedures. Before we left, he said something that made me feel a shift inside. He said that once a case like this was opened, any related records held by the company fell under their authority. It meant the airline would have to provide maintenance logs, internal messages, and incident reports when requested. If there were gaps or edits, those would also become part of the record. On the drive back, I watched the city pass by outside the car window. For years, all my efforts had stayed inside the walls of SkyReach. Now, for the first time, there were people outside those walls looking in. At home that evening, I sat at my kitchen table with a notebook. I started to build a clear timeline on paper. Not for them, but for myself. I wrote down the dates of my first report, the meeting in the auditorium, the exit interview, my last day, the rushed sign-off morning, the flight date, the moment Elena asked me to leave the aircraft, the sight of it surrounded by vehicles. As I wrote, the story of the past few years stopped being a blur. It became a row of points that connected. Each date had a document, a memory, a name attached to it. It made me see my own role differently. I had thought of myself as a powerless former worker, pushed out and forgotten. Now I could see that I held pieces of a puzzle that others needed. Over the next week, Nora kept me informed in short updates. She said the safety board had requested logs and communications from SkyReach about Flight 712 and about the system I had reported on. She said we should stay patient and not talk to media or post anything online, no matter how angry we felt. She reminded me that our strength was in being calm and factual. I agreed. I had tried anger before. It had brought me a sore throat and some late nights, but not much else. Calm facts, placed in the right hands, seemed to be doing more in a few days than my loud complaints had done in years. On a quiet evening, my sister came over with a casserole and asked again what had really happened. This time, I told her more. I did not mention legal terms or procedures. I just said that I had warned the company about a problem, they had pushed me out, and now the same problem had led to an incident. I said I was talking to people who could do something about it. She sat at my table, her hands around a mug of tea, and listened with wide eyes. She reminded me of our father, who had worked on trains and always said that machines did not forgive shortcuts. When I finished, she reached across the table and squeezed my hand. She said she was proud of me for not letting this go. Later that night, after she left, I walked into my small living room and looked at the space where the binders used to be. The shelf looked strange without them, but knowing they were now being reviewed by someone beyond SkyReach made me feel lighter. I did not know yet what the company would do or how they would react. For now, all I knew was that the story was no longer only theirs to tell. It was written in my notes, in my recording, in the crew reports, in the logs the safety board had requested. It was leaving the private world of company meetings and stepping into a larger, brighter room where excuses had less power. On a Monday morning, Nora called and asked if I was sitting down. Her voice was calm, but I could hear a different weight under it. I pulled out a chair at my kitchen table and said I was listening. She told me the safety board had shared part of my report with SkyReach. In response, the company had called for an internal safety review meeting with their board and senior managers. The safety board had agreed to attend, and they wanted me there too as the original inspector on that aircraft. She said this was not a casual chat. It would be formal, recorded, and possibly watched by more eyes than we expected. For a moment, I could not speak. I had imagined many possible outcomes, from quiet dismissal to a simple, "Thank you, we'll look into it." I had never really pictured myself sitting in a room with the people who pushed me out, while outside investigators asked them questions. Nora broke the silence. She said we had some time before the meeting, but not much. She suggested we use it to prepare carefully. She did not want me to go in there with just a box of papers and anger. She wanted a simple, clear story laid out on paper and in my head. We met at her office again 2 days later. On the table were 3 neat stacks of paper, each in a thin binder with colored tabs. She had organized my material into structured sets. One stack was labeled with the aircraft registration number, another was marked with my name and employment dates. The third had a simple title, Timeline. She explained how she had arranged things. The first binder showed the technical pattern on that aircraft over time. The second showed my role, my reports, and the company's response. The third mapped the events around Flight 712. She said that inside the meeting, people would talk fast and throw many words into the air. These binders would help us bring them back to clear facts when needed. I turned the pages slowly. The work looked nothing like my messy old binders at home. Dates were printed cleanly, sections were marked. My writing had been turned into straight paragraphs and bullet points. It felt strange to see my story laid out like that, so neat and official. Nora watched my face. She said she knew this might feel overwhelming. She reminded me that I did not have to argue with anyone in that room. My job was to answer questions and, if needed, point to the right page. The rest would be between the safety board, the company, and the law. We spent the rest of the morning going over possible questions. She played the role of a board member, then of a manager, then of the investigator. She asked why I had kept copies of my reports. She asked why I thought I had been let go. She asked what I had seen and what I had not seen. Each time, she guided me back to short answers. She told me to avoid guessing about motives or feelings. If I did not know something, I should say so. If I was not sure, I should say that too. She said nothing gave more strength to a witness than simple honesty. Around noon, she closed the last binder and leaned back. She said there was one more thing we needed to discuss, how I felt about seeing Victor and Tyler again. She did not say their names like enemies. She said them like items on a list, things we needed to consider. I told her the truth. I said part of me wanted to walk into that building, point a finger across the table, and repeat every dismissal they had thrown at me. I said another part of me just wanted the whole thing over, to never hear their names again. I admitted I did not know which part would be louder on the day of the meeting. She nodded and said that was normal. Then she said something that stayed with me. She said that people like Victor were strong inside their own walls, but much less so when someone brought those walls down and replaced them with rules he did not control. She reminded me that in that room, he would not be the host. He would be a person answering to higher authorities. On my way home, I stopped at a small diner where my sister liked to eat on weekends. I sent her a message, and she agreed to meet me there that evening. I did not tell her everything over text. I wanted to see her face when I spoke. She arrived in a blue sweater, her hair pulled back, carrying a plastic container of muffins. "Just in case," she said. We sat in a booth by the window. The diner smelled of coffee and fried onions. A server brought us water and wiped the table edge with a cloth. I told her about the upcoming meeting. I said there would be board members, the safety board, maybe even some press. I explained that I had to sit there and answer questions about the very reports that had led to my dismissal. I told her I was not going there to fight, but to tell the truth. She listened quietly, her hands around her mug. When I finished, she looked at me for a long time. Then she said she remembered how excited I was when I got the job at SkyReach, how I used to call her and talk about systems and checklists like they were old friends. She said she also remembered the way my voice sounded after the HR meeting, flat and drained. She reached across the table and put her hand on mine. She said she could not tell me what would happen in that room, but she was glad I was not hiding at home anymore. She said our father used to say that if you see something wrong in your field of work and keep quiet, you become part of it. She believed I was doing what he would have done. On the day before the meeting, I tried to keep my routine normal. I made coffee, washed dishes, took a short walk, but everything I did felt like a slow countdown. In the afternoon, Nora called to confirm the time and place again. She said there might be media at the building entrance, but we were not required to speak to them. She reminded me once more that this was not a show, it was a formal review. That night, I laid out my clothes like a child before the first day of school. Not a suit, I owned only one, and it did not fit well anymore. Instead, I chose clean dark trousers, a white shirt, and a plain jacket. I polished my shoes until they reflected a little light. I wanted to look simple, but not careless. Sleep did not come easily. When I finally drifted off, I dreamed of walking down a long hallway full of doors with no signs. Each door opened into another hangar, another office, another gate. I woke up before dawn, my heart beating faster than usual. In the morning, the sky over the city was pale and clear. I took a shower, dressed, and checked my watch again and again, even though I knew I had plenty of time. I kept glancing at the empty shelf where my old binders had stood. Knowing they were in use elsewhere gave me a strange sense of distance, like the story had grown larger than my small apartment. Nora picked me up outside my building. She drove, and I watched the streets pass by. We did not talk much at first. Then, as we neared the business district, she went over a few final points. She reminded me that if anyone tried to put words in my mouth, I could simply say I did not agree. She said I did not have to answer questions that strayed far outside the topic, and that if anything felt unclear, she would step in. SkyReach headquarters rose ahead of us, glass and steel shining in the sun. I had been there many times before for meetings and training sessions. Back then, I had walked in with an employee badge, head down, thinking about work orders and shift schedules. This time, I walked up the steps with a visitor badge waiting inside and a lawyer at my side. The lobby was just as I remembered. High ceilings, polished floors, company awards on the walls, and a large screen showing promotional videos of smiling passengers and perfect landings. The front desk had 2 receptionists. One of them looked up as we approached. At first, her gaze slid past me in that automatic way staff have with unknown guests. Then she saw Nora, saw the small folder in her hand with the safety board logo on it, and her expression changed. Her smile became more professional, and she asked our names and purpose. Nora gave her the details, including the case number. The receptionist checked a list, then nodded and handed us visitor badges with printed labels. Mine had my full name and the word guest under it. Beneath that, in smaller letters, was the name of the department arranging the meeting, Board and Safety Review. We walked through a security gate and into a quieter corridor. As we waited for the elevator, I looked at the awards on the walls, a framed magazine page for on-time leader, a trophy for lowest delay rate, photos of executives shaking hands with partners. There was no frame on the wall for most honestly reported incidents or most thorough inspections. The elevator arrived with a soft chime. We stepped in, and Nora pressed the button for the top floor. I watched the numbers climb. My reflection in the metal door looked older than the man in the photo at home, but his eyes were steadier. The doors opened onto a wide hallway with soft carpet. A staff member waited there, a young man in a crisp shirt with a company badge. He introduced himself and said he had been asked to guide us to the meeting room. His tone was polite but guarded, like someone trying to follow a script in unfamiliar territory. We followed him past glass offices and closed doors. Through one window, I saw Tyler standing by a desk with a tablet in his hand, speaking to someone I could not see. He glanced up, noticed me in the hallway, and froze for just a fraction of a second. Then he looked back down and continued his conversation, but his shoulders had gone slightly rigid. I did not stop. The staff member led us to a large double door at the end of the hall. On the wall next to it was a small sign, Boardroom A. There was also a printed note taped below, with the safety board's logo and the words, Safety Review Session, Restricted Access. The staff member knocked once, then opened one of the doors and stood aside to let us enter. The room was bright, with long windows on one side and a large table in the center. People were already seated around it. Some wore suits, some wore company badges, and at the far end I saw Raj arranging some papers beside a projector. I stepped over the threshold and felt the air shift around me. It was cooler here, denser somehow. I heard the soft shuffle of chairs as a few heads turned in my direction. I saw Victor at the far side of the table, his posture straight, his eyes sharp. For years he had spoken about safety and efficiency through microphones in company halls. Now he sat in a room where his words would land on a very different kind of record. Nora walked slightly ahead of me and guided me to 2 empty chairs near the side of the table. I sat down, set my hands flat on the smooth wood, and took a slow breath. For a long time, I had felt like a man pushed out to the edge of this company, watching from far away. Now I was back in its center, not as an employee, but as someone whose quiet notes and reports had finally led to this moment. The chair of the board called the session to order. Names were read, roles stated. Raj introduced himself again for the record, then introduced Nora and me. My title sounded strange in that room, former senior safety inspector. For years they had tried to make me feel like I had never really been one. Now it was on the official record. Raj began with a short summary. He spoke about Flight 712, the fumes in the cabin, the return to the gate. He mentioned that there had been earlier reports about the same aircraft and system. Then he said they would first hear from the person who had written those reports. All eyes turned to me. I kept it simple. I said how long I had worked for SkyReach. I named the aircraft registration. I described the system I had been worried about and the pattern of wear I had seen. I did not raise my voice. I did not look at Victor or Tyler much. I spoke to the room. When I finished, Raj asked me to confirm that the binder on the table matched my past reports. I said yes. He opened it, showed the dates, the photos, the recommendation for full review. Then he placed beside it a copy of the maintenance log for the morning of Flight 712, which the safety board had obtained from SkyReach. The difference was clear even without deep technical knowledge. My detailed warnings on one side, a short entry on the other showing a quick check, a brief note, and a signature line with Tyler's name. Raj then played the recording from my exit interview. The soft HR voice filled the boardroom, speaking about my style, not fitting the new model, and how my standards caused expensive delays. No one spoke while it played. Even the air felt still. After that, Raj projected selected lines from internal maintenance chat. The words appeared on the screen, jokes about the old inspector, comments about clearing the aircraft to avoid schedule problems, a line about Victor wanting fewer blockers. Finally, Raj read from the crew reports. The captain's description of the smell. Elena's written note about urging a former inspector passenger to deplane because she believed his earlier warnings were not taken seriously. Silence settled when he finished. Then the board chair asked Victor to respond. Victor tried to frame everything as an honest mistake. He said procedures were followed. He said the system readings were within limits. He suggested I was seeing patterns where none existed. But each time he spoke, Raj or Nora pointed back to a page, a date, a message. The room kept returning to paper, not feelings. After some time, the board chair asked everyone to step out except the board, Raj, and company legal counsel. We waited in a side area with glass walls. Through them, I could see Victor leaning toward the chair, speaking fast. I could not hear the words, but his hands moved more than usual. At last, we were called back in. The chair's face was pale but steady. He read from a prepared note. He said the board accepted the findings of the safety board's preliminary review. He said my past reports had identified a real risk and that company responses had been inadequate. He said the decision to end my role appeared linked to my insistence on safety and that this was not acceptable. Then he announced that Victor was being removed from all operational duties, effective immediately, and placed under separate review. He stated that the board would cooperate fully with the safety board's investigation and that outside auditors would review maintenance practices across the fleet. A security staff member stepped quietly to Victor's side. Victor unclipped his badge, placed it on the table, and stood up. For the first time since I had known him, he did not look in control. Our eyes met for a brief moment. There were no words between us. The chair thanked me for my cooperation and said someone would contact me if further questions came up. Papers were gathered, chairs pushed back. People began to talk in low voices. I closed my binder, slid my chair back, and walked toward the door. As I stepped into the hallway, the noise of the room fell behind me. I held the visitor badge in my hand, felt the thin plastic bend, and then dropped it in the tray by the exit as I left the building.